Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Checkhelder-Signan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL is proud to sponsor Robin Wall Kimmerer's visit to Central Library today as part of the community-wide Rochester Reads program presented by Writers and Books. With support from FFRPL, Central Library has welcomed Rochester Reads authors to this venue since 2014. Central Library patrons have attended Rochester Reads programs with award-winning journalist Omar El-Akkad, novelist and memoirist Raina Grande, internationally best-selling novelist Rini Denfield, award-winning memoirist and essayist Sonia Livingston, best-selling novelist Karen Thompson Walker, and novelist and Pulitzer Prize finalist Eowyn Ivey. I'd like to welcome all of our participants today, those here in person, and our hundreds of virtual participants. Thanks to Writers and Books for presenting the Rochester Reads program in our community. Thanks to our guest author for participating in this year's event. Thanks to our ASL interpreters for helping to make our event accessible. And thanks to the many FFRPL donors for making our sponsorship of Kimmerer's visit to Central Library possible. Please join me in welcoming Ren Van Meenen, Director of Community Reading Programs from Writers and Books, to our podium. And Ren will introduce our guest author.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome to the 20th year of Rochester Reads. After a year's hiatus, we're back. We have returned and are particularly excited to share this year's book with all of you. As a foundation for our sharing today, Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands in which we live and work, whether you're with us here in person or joining virtually. We acknowledge that we were founded on and are beneficiaries of the intentional exclusion, genocide, and erasure of Indigenous peoples. Today, we gather on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca, and are part of the sovereign Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We invite you to join us in honoring the lands we occupy and the history of these Indigenous peoples, and paying our respect to those communities who remain part of the past, present, and future of the places we now call home. We also acknowledge the people forcibly taken from their ancestral lands in Africa and enslaved to build the economic infrastructure from which this country has long benefited. We furthermore recognize the interconnections between the enduring impacts of colonization, enslavement, and our current climate emergency, which manifest in myriad ways, including habitat destruction and global dispossession, environmental exploitation in Indigenous communities and in communities of color especially, and increasing climate refugee crises. We are grateful to the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library and the Central Library of Rochester and Monroe County, this event's generous sponsor, as well as to our library colleagues who work year-round tirelessly to ensure that transformational books like Braiding Sweetgrass get into your hands. It takes a village to deliver the dozens of events that make up a month of Rochester Reads activities. This year, 24 libraries, institutions, nature and cultural sites, and over 20 sponsors, funders, and friends partnered with us to make this unique citywide program a reality for the 20th time. We are indebted to all. More information on the full program and these supporters can be found on our informational table. Before I introduce Robin, some more housekeeping. After a short reading, we will open it up to audience Q&A, which is one of the joys of this particular event here at the library, and you will be able to engage in dialogue with her. So because we're a small group in a small room, please just raise your hand and we will call on you, and Robin will repeat the questions so all can be heard. After that, we will adjourn to our book table in the back for signing. We do have books for sale, both Braiding Sweetgrass and many, many others. And in the interest of social distancing, Robin will sign books, but you will not be able to chat with her individually. Our book signing assistants will take your book, write the name you would like the signing to include, and pass the book on for you. Another will return your book to you. We thank you for your understanding and cooperation in these unusual times. Now to the main event. Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, is a botanist whose connection to the earth she studies began many generations before she was born. Like Sky Woman, who descended to what became Turtle Island in the legend that begins Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer passes on gifts of soil and seed and weaves for us a tapestry of science and creativity, a cloth of connections between mothers and daughters, moss and stones, trees and air, plants and water, humans and animals and the earth, between the colors of aster and goldenrod, even between college student and cattail, my favorite chapter. As a college professor, it's my favorite chapter. These inextricable bonds are reflected in her clear prose, her infectious enthusiasm, and above all, her generous sharing of both her gained knowledge and her innate wisdom. When I first read Braiding Sweetgrass a couple of years ago, I was enthralled by its overarching narrative, from the movement of its most molecular examinations to the global possibilities of a reimagined future. Like the sacred act of the title, Kimmerer braids our shared story. She encourages us, entices us, implores us to look, and more importantly, a la Thoreau, to see, so that we may live, even thrive on this earth, not apart, but as one interdependent and mutually supportive whole. In the book, Kimmerer writes, "Science gives us knowing, but caring is something else." In Braiding Sweetgrass, Kimmerer has demystified scientific thinking and processes for her readers, entwining them in her human fascination with being on the land and being part of nature. But she also teaches us how to care. For Kimmerer, gratitude is not merely a platitude, and reciprocity is a way of life. We have so much to learn from her as a scholar, as a writer, as an educator, yes, but more importantly, from her expansive worldview, one that is capable of sustaining life in all of its tangible physical forms, as well as its magical manifestations for the good of all beings. After all, as she writes, what happens to one happens to all. We can starve together or feast together. All flourishing is mutual. Kimmerer ends Braiding Sweetgrass with lines that are particularly resonant today. Whatever our gift, we are called to give it, and to dance for the renewal of the world, in return for the privilege of breath. Please welcome Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Bonjour, Annie. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to see you all here. Thank you for coming. It is always a delight as a writer to engage with readers. So I was so happy when I saw that this event was primarily dialogue. I'm really eager for that. I also want to give gratitude for that beautiful introduction. I'm really touched by the depth of your reading and consideration, and what a powerful land acknowledgement. Just all honor to the creators of these statements, that we might all follow that path to really be where we are and in community and reciprocity with one another. When I was asked to read a little something, of course, it's always hard to choose, you know, which of those lovely children do you bring along with you? So I was trying to imagine who you might be and what you might like to hear about. And here at the end of the fall, as we are thinking about putting our gardens to bed and watching the dry seed pods come, I thought I would read a story from the garden. It should be them who tells this story, but they're quiet beings whose voices are hard to hear, especially in the wind. I've stood among them and listened. The loudest thing is my own heartbeat. But then as you settle into the quiet, there's more. Corn leaves rustle with a signature sound, a papery conversation with each other and with the breeze. And on a hot day in July, when the corn can grow 6 inches a day, there's a squeak of internodes expanding, stretching the stem toward the light. Leaves escape their sheaths with a drawn-out creak, And sometimes when all is still, you can hear the sudden pop of ruptured pith cells when water-filled cells become too large and turgid for the confines of the stem. There are the sounds of being, but this is not the same as the voice. The beans must make a caressing sound, a tiny hiss, as a soft-haired leader twines around the scabrous stem of corn. Surfaces vibrate delicately against each other. Tendrils pulse as they cinch around a stem, but only a flea beetle standing nearby could hear. But this is not the song of beans. I've lain among ripening pumpkins, and this is what I hear. A creaking as the parasol leaves rock back and forth, tethered by their tendrils. Wind lifts the edge of leaves and eases them back down again. A microphone settled in the hollow of a swelling pumpkin would reveal the pop of seeds filling and the rush of water filling succulent orange flesh. These are sounds, but not the story. Plants tell their stories not by what they say, but by what they do. Now, what if you were a teacher, a keeper of great knowledge, but had no voice to speak it and no pen to write it? What if you had no language at all, and yet there was something you needed to say? Wouldn't you dance it? Wouldn't you act it out? Wouldn't your every movement tell the story? In time, you would become so eloquent that just to gaze upon you would reveal it all. And so it is with these silent green lives, who are also allergy promoters. Excuse me. After all, a sculpture is just a piece of rock with topography hammered out and chiseled in. And yet, that piece of rock can open your heart in a way that makes you different for having seen it. It brings its message without a single word. Not everyone will get it, though. The language of stone is difficult. Rock mumbles. But plants speak louder than stones in a way that every breathing thing can understand. Plants teach in the universal language of food. Years ago, Awiatka, a Cherokee writer, pressed into my hand a small packet. It was a corn leaf, dry and folded into a pouch, tied with a bit of string. She smiled and warned, "Don't open till spring." The next May, I untied the packet, and there was the gift, 3 seeds. One is a golden triangle, a kernel of corn with a broadly dimpled top and narrowed to a hard white tip. The glossy bean is speckled brown, curved and sleek, its inner belly marked with that white eye, the hilum. Its sides like a polished stone between thumb and forefinger, but this is no stone. And there is a pumpkin seed like an oval china dish, its edge crimped shut like a pie crust, bulging with filling. Growing together, the 3 plants utilize the space and light efficiently by spreading their leaves in patterns that cooperate instead of compete. Growing together, they are artwork that has created itself from the laws of complementarity. The organic symmetry of forms belong together. The placement of every leaf, the harmony of shapes speaks their message. Respect one another. Support one another. Bring your gift to the world and receive the gift of others. And there will be enough for us all. The beauty of the partnership is that each plant is a sovereign being. The way of the 3 sisters reminds me of one of the basic teachings of our people. The most important thing a person can know is their own unique gift and how to use it in the world. Individuality is cherished and nurtured. For to be in community, you don't surrender your individuality. In order for the whole to flourish, each person has to be strong in who they are, to carry their gift with conviction so that it can be shared with others. Being among the three sisters reminds us that in reciprocity, we fill our spirits as well as our bellies. I hold in my hand the genius of Indigenous agriculture, the three sisters. Together, these plants, corn, beans, and squash, feed the people, they feed the land, and they feed our imaginations of how it is that we might live. Thank you to those beautiful plants for their lessons. Thank you to those wonderful Indigenous scientists who thought to bring together those three remarkable plants in symbiosis. So with that as an introduction to maybe bring our memories back to being in the pages of Braiding Sweetgrass, I would be happy to answer any questions and engage in dialogue with you all. So have at it. Only easy questions, though. Yes.
What plants would you suggest for someone
The question was, what plants would I recommend for someone who wants to establish relationship but is new to gardening? That's a really good question. And everybody's garden, I think I'll see lots of nods here, is a real reflection of your personality. Oh, if you saw my garden, you would know me. My cousin is laughing, like, yep. My problem is I can't bear, if something volunteers in the garden, I can't bear to discourage them. And so it's a bit of a hodgepodge, a lot of diversity, shall we say. So if I was going to begin a garden and give that guidance, I would choose greens. I would choose kale and chard and those very generous leafy plants that we love to eat and are really faithful. They will just keep going with you all season long. But again, if you saw my garden, yeah, there's a lot of greens there, but there's also a lot of flowers. I like to have them all together, and they complement one another, drawing pollinators and those things like the companion plants that will deter pests but attract pollinators. So I would say greens and flowers, and even better, edible flowers. Does anybody plant nasturtiums in their garden? Yeah, look at all the hands. Of course, because you can eat them and they're beautiful and they last. Once they start blooming, they don't stop till frost. So to me, the way of what I really hear in your question is, how do I create connection? How do I open myself to those connections? Food and beauty are great ways to do that. And those plants that are very generous and not too fussy is a good way to begin. Oh, could I add one more? I don't know about you, but one of the highlights of my year is when the beans come out of the ground. Just watching those beans come up out of the ground, and they'll feed you wonderfully, but it's really good for the spirit to see the power of that little hypocaudal hook lifting up what is for them tons of soil to reach the light. So they're good teachers in that way too. Yeah, happy gardening. Yes.
I wish that your vision of how foods, animals, plants of nature work together, a holistic understanding would be somehow expressed in our educational system with children from 3 and beyond. And without the balkanization of the sciences over here,
Oh,
the
yes.
humanities over here, the arts, and movement and dance and acting performance, everything is part of this whole. And pedagogy, what would we need to do in this country to embrace this holistic approach and imagine it? Is it even
This is a huge question, and I don't want my answer to be oversimplified, but in this setting, to me, the answer is clear, and it is two words. It's go outside. The pedagogy of the land is really emerging in a lot of educational settings as a way of uniting exactly those disciplines, that, you know, spirit, science, literature, art, gym class, you know, it all happens when you're on the land. It's seamless, and it's a full body engagement. And one of the things that I worry tremendously about, which I think is implicit in your question, is that we're teaching kids to pay attention to one of their senses, right? Their ability to look at screens, or to look at a book, or to look at the authority who is the teacher, as opposed to remembering that we have all these ways of knowing and engaging them and being outside. Whether the teacher is teaching it or not, the land is the teacher, and the land will teach you that very quickly. Honestly, I was quite hopeful that one of the silver linings of COVID might be outdoor school, because of course of the safety associated with it, and then all of the benefits of I was going to say reconnecting kids to nature. Kids are connected to nature from birth, and then we create environments where, you know, it's swept to the side. So I say get outside, and it doesn't have to be, you know, a distant patch of woods. It can be a carefully inspired playground. It can be moss in the sidewalk cracks. What it is about paying attention, you know, using all of your senses for the natural world that is around you. So I, like you, absolutely endorse that movement toward more holistic education. Yeah, so I don't know how to implement that, but I hope that you do and that you will. And I should say that, you know, one of the delights of feedback from readers about Braiding Sweetgrass is what people are doing with these teachings, and many of them are curricula, land-based curricula. I think of a number of folks who have written, said, I started a forest school because of this. I was fired up to remember how important this is. So curricula, forest schools, nature centers, et cetera, are really energizing around these issues. So I'm hopeful, but we've got a ways to go. Yeah.
I think the enormous positive response to your book and the eagerness of so many readers to engage with it, to me, demonstrates a great hunger to return to that place of natural noticing.
Yes.
And so it gives me hope, I guess.
Oh, I'm so glad you observed that. Yes. The way I try to think about this, or I try to understand it, is that we are in the process as a culture of what I think of as the great remembering. The great remembering what it would be like to be in connection with your food, with your landscape, with your senses, to be open to the teachings of the land. We're remembering. And it's also important to see, well, how did we forget this? Well, let's look at that. What are the forces and why that are aligned against us being connected to the land? That's perhaps a whole nother discussion, but this was not passive forgetting on our part, right? There are forces out there that would say, well, you know, what happens when you're connected to the land, you know, to an abundance? Do you suppose you buy as much stuff if you're feeling connected and abundant and peaceful and in community? You do not. You do not. So in a sense, our ability to pay attention to the natural world has been hijacked to say, well, you should really be paying attention to these things, not to the natural world. So we need to resist that, to identify it and to resist it, to say it's not our fault that we have forgotten, but let's remember together. Yes. Yes, the question, if you couldn't hear, was could I comment on I think on the emerging science and understanding of the ways in which forests communicate? Do I have that right? Okay, great. This is, and I'm so glad that you framed that as the new old science, because the knowing that plant beings are communicative individuals, that they are persons, is a deep assumption of the Indigenous worldview. And that, again, it's one of those other things we have forgotten or set aside for very similar reasons. But the science, the Western science, is really catching up to traditional knowledge. I suppose one of I'll point to Suzanne Simard's wonderful book, if you haven't read Finding the Mother Tree. A wonderful, wonderful book about her own research about understanding the underground communication between trees. But long before Suzanne's remarkable work, there have been decades of scientists who are showing us about communication among trees with pheromones through the air. And now there's all kinds of good science that says plants are communicating with sound. Did you know that plants can hear? I'm a plant scientist. I read these papers and I think, yeah, there's pretty good evidence here. Really good evidence that plants can learn, that plants can remember. This whole new field of cognitive plant biology is exploding and very, very exciting. And I think it circles back around to this understanding embedded in Indigenous knowledge. That these beings are communicative, that trees are social beings is essentially what we're saying, what they're saying, and what the evidence is showing as well. Just yesterday, a wonderful new book of essays came out. The editor is my friend and colleague, Dr. Monica Galliano, and it's called The Mind of Plants. And it is kind of an artistic look at plant communication and sentience, as well as a scientific look. So thank you so much for that question. We are on the verge of a real revolution in our understanding of plant biology, but of course it does not, it's a very short step to a whole new revolution in ethical philosophy about how it is that we live in the world when we start to recognize that plants are conscious individuals and have their own social structures. Exciting. Yes.
Tap into your scientific knowledge. I'm blessed with a little homestead in the Bristol Hills, and I love all of the book, but I really resonated with your words of the maples because I'm surrounded by my dream is to be able to live more on that land and not have to go off to work every day, but to just immerse myself on the land and have a sustainable place of being where I can grow my food. And maples come into that because I have a son who works for a maple production facility, and he's trying to talk me into running tubing and gentle suction from maples to acquire more sap for syrup making processes. And I feel like that's exploitation. He tries to assure me that it's not hurting the trees and it would be a way for me to make additional income and be there more. But with your knowledge of botany and everything, can you give me advice on that? The gentle drip into the buckets that we enjoy every year, and we share a boiled down celebration of spring. And I just am on the edge of actually making it more production, how that would affect my friends.
Mm. Well, in your last sentence, how that would affect my friends, the maples. That is a worldview that doesn't really want your resistance comes from you don't want to commodify your friends, right? Or stress your friends. So there is that tension between why are you making syrup? Is it for engagement and relationship, to say nothing of the delicious products, but and the honor of receiving those gifts of the maples. But when things become commodities, our thinking around efficiency and productivity kicks in. So that I think is one of the things to really honor in your struggle to think about this is what is it that I want to produce, relationship or syrup. That being said, I am not a maple biologist, but my understanding from the folks who run our college sugar bush is that using the tubing does not take more than the trees would produce by dripping. There are production facilities that do, that really apply suction and draw a lot more, but just connecting the sap taps to a collecting device with the tubing is not necessarily extractive or exploitative. So you want to learn more about the system, but it is, to me, aesthetically, it's challenging. I feel your struggle around that. I too love that plink 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 into the buckets in the springtime. But if you're thinking about production, I think the most important thing to do is to use those tenets of the honorable harvest and apply those honorable harvest guidelines to your question. And that will certainly come down to the way that it's used. But speaking of our maples, which, as you know, it's so fun to talk to a group where I can say, well, as you know, I love maples too. and one of the things that we also, as maple lovers, probably every one of us in this room, that we have to confront is the cost of climate change on our maples. They're iconic for us, aren't they? Anybody else missing the bright colors this fall? Right? We're not getting that maple glory this fall. I don't know what the spring sap season will look like. But the best forest ecological information suggests that with the climate models, that it won't be long before the maples become climate refugees, that the so-called environmental envelope in which they can reproduce is closing because of climate change. And that we might, by the next generation, live in a place that is not Maple Nation. And if there's anything of the many, many things that fire us up to urgency in confronting the impending climate catastrophe, when my heart goes to those maples, that lights a fire under me. Thank you.
Yes.
I've been an avid gardener my adult life, and I've been thinking about trying to educate myself more and more about native gardening. I love flowers, I love growing everything I love color, and yet I'm realizing some of the things that I've planted over the years can be destructive to our And so thinking about what said about the maples, not all maples are, from what I understand, good things to have here. We've got Norway
Right.
in my yard, and those are not the same as the maples that
Right.
it's a tough call to figure out what to get rid of. And what to allow. And what are some of the resources or things that we can go to that help us? I would turn my whole yard into a native yard, but it's
Yeah.
an acre, and at my
it's a complex question. We could really engage around this in great depth. But one of the things that I would say is you can stop mowing your lawn. You can just stop mowing your lawn. Will you get a year or two of species that you might not relish? Yeah, you probably are. You probably will. Those annual and biennial rosette plants that are waiting for you to stop mowing. But once you do stop mowing, it changes the conditions in such a way that it tends to discourage them. Certainly not all of them. There are plenty of plants that we might think of as less desirable that will come up that you'll have to rebalance with. But the quickest way to that naturalized landscape is to stop mowing. And if you look at the carbon footprint of mowing your grass, it's a net carbon emitter. I forget what the tonnage is. A lot. I'm sorry, I don't know what it is, but you're a carbon source if you're mowing your lawn, a carbon dioxide source, whereas you're a powerful carbon sink just by not mowing your grass, not only in the above ground biomass, but all the carbon that's going into the soil. So it's important. And also when you think about when people are often saying, well, what can I do in my own sphere? Planting native plant gardens is a major one because it's so good for pollinators and for birds. National Wildlife Federation has wonderful guidelines on how to make your yard into a wildlife habitat, be it a postage stamp lot or acres. Your cooperative extension has such guidance as well. There's a wonderful organization. I think they changed their name, but it used to, I know them as the Wild Ones. You could still probably find. Oh, well, great. Great.
But then what do I do with these other things that have to in a way that doesn't
Yeah, it's a matter of balance. I laughingly say this, I get to think about this balance a lot while I'm weeding garlic mustard. And, I'm not trying to eradicate that species, but I'm trying to create a balance. This somewhat in the conservation as well as the gardening community, we tend to have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction about exotic species. But not all exotic species are invasive, right? The invasive ones we want to be very careful to try to rein in, but we also have to be sure that the cure isn't worse than their presence. And in the case of a Norway maple, yeah, it gets complicated. You think, oh yeah, I don't want a Norway maple, I want a sugar maple. But we are in this time of tremendous climate urgency. Who's going to do a better job of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Your big Norway maple or your seedling sugar maple? It's complicated. It's really complicated. Yeah. But thank you for embracing it and for thinking about these things. And you've given me an opportunity to also comment on this balance. When we say to ourselves, what can we do? We often think about it as within our individual realm, our individual yards, our individual consumer preferences, et cetera. And as you know, from reading the book, particularly in the question about the pond, I am, like probably all of you, saying, well, where are my responsibilities? To my little pond or to Onondaga Lake? To my little piece of old farmland or to the Amazon rainforest? And the answer is both. That we have the responsibility to act within our own realms when we can, but also to act for systems change, in addition to individual change. If we're planting native gardens because of pollinators, because of the massive bee die-off, not only of honeybees, but of native bees as well, what should also be in your gardening bucket, along with your seeds in your trowel? Write to the New York State Legislature and have them pass the Save the Bees Act. It's already through the Senate. It's sitting in the Assembly. that should be in our garden buckets too. That's on our to-do list. Because in that way we promote systemic change as well as individual change. And that's where I try to make that balance, is to say, you know, what are my responsibilities both on the ground, but to system change as well. So many, yes.
So this kind of connects to some of the questions you've been reflecting on. I'm on a board for a park, and we've been discussing vegetation. And one of the conversations that we've had is whether to bring in species that are native a little further south in anticipation of climate change and of the ecological and plant community changes.
Mhm.
Bring in, and so I'm curious about how you reflect on the balance and actually sort of assisted migration.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you asked. This is very much on my mind as well. And as you know, a big debate in the conservation community. There are some folks who think we should not be doing assisted migration. I am not one of them. Plants move slow. And because, again, it's sort of systemic, we have created environments in which plant migration is very difficult. They can't migrate across municipalities, right? They need corridors, they need migration corridors, and they need us. And in Indigenous plant geography, there are so many examples of how our people always moved plants. That we call it range extension, anthropogenic range extension. It means you put some seeds in your pocket and planted them in the next place that you went because they were important and you want them to thrive. And a good friend of mine, Henry Lickers, a Seneca biologist, calls this helping forests walk. And that indeed we should be helping forests walk. I agree with that. I'm not talking about taking species from far away. I'm not talking about bringing in exotic species. But for example, on the little patch of land that I steward, which is almost all sugar maple, beech, you know, the northern hardwoods, I'm planting tulip poplars. I'm planting Kentucky coffee tree. I'm planting oaks who were within their range, but they're not there now. Well, how are they going to get there? So I think it's a good idea, particularly in a park, because what you have an opportunity to do there is to create relationship with those plants so that the people who are engaging with this conserved space get to know those plants, and the plants get to know them. And that's part of helping them walk as well. So as I say, there are a number of different perspectives on this question of assisted migration, but you know, language means a lot. When we talk about, well, assisted migration, that might sound debatable. Helping forests walk, who's not for that? Yeah. Yes, you were next and then in the back, yeah.
Well, just helping plants grow. I really enjoyed it. Plants that grow.
Oh, the plantains, yes, yep.
Because, you know, that's how they spread. They were walking in.
Right.
Most of us want to get rid of it.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Sometimes those lowly plants, well, as you know, many of them are really good medicines and they're good food. They're so resilient. They're always with us. So yeah, all honor to dandelions and plantains and chicories and Queen Anne's lace. They're with us for good reason. We should appreciate them more. Yes, in the back. Yes. Sure. The question was, would I share a little bit about my writing process, particularly the balance between writing and reflection? For me, writing is almost always reflective. And, there's that old adage of, do we write what we know, or do we write to find out what we know? And in many cases, for me, putting pen to paper is an exploration. It's an exploration of the connections between different images and different plants or stories that I have. So I think about writing itself as a deeply reflective process. And in terms of writing process, there's so many dimensions to that. Oftentimes we're asked, well, do you write every day? I'm a college professor, so yes. But do I work on a book or an essay every day? No. And that in-between time, that interstitial time, is absolutely reflection. Because I always have a little notebook handy because of the ideas that will come while I'm thinking about something else or working on something else. One of the things that's important in my process, and has recently been sort of validated by scientists who study such things as creativity, is the balance between physical work and writing. I can, on a day devoted to writing, I can write for hours. So I can just sit down and go. But I've learned not to, that after 4 hours or so, I like to go stack firewood. I like to go dig potatoes. I like to go for a walk. And what I find is that in that sort of mindlessness of stacking firewood, all those pieces that I might have been struggling with on the page just emerge. And I think it's in Liz Gilbert's book on Big Magic that she writes about the science associated with this, periods of active intellectual engagement followed by periods of physical engagement are super productive. Allowing me to give a rejoinder to my neighbor who knows that she's a farmer neighbor who lives across the way, and she knows that I try to stay home at least one day a week, pre-COVID days, to write. And one afternoon she caught me out planting daffodils and she yelled across the road, "Doesn't look like writing to me." Like that. I thought, oh, caught. But in fact, it is. It is. So that's my excuse now. Yes.
So my question actually is a little bit more about you as a college professor. You just started the library science program in order to decentralize, bring in more Indigenous. Wondering if you're seeing either among your students or colleagues that some of these barriers that you experience, that if not being taken down, but shifting or to other places.
Yes. Certainly awareness of multiple ways of knowing, awareness of the value of differences in lived experience and worldview and perspective. That awareness is there. In my academic world is a hyper-scientific one. So perhaps the opening is slower there. But there's absolutely an opening. But what I find is there is willingness and eagerness to engage, but not knowing how. And so that is one of the sort of the next hurdles is to try to help people know how to do that. And one of the things that has been really important in my many years of doing this is watching the importance of students in teaching people how, and students opening that space. as you know, when I started college, I was the only Native woman and one of the only women in my school. And today I can sit in seminar with a cohort of 8 to 10 different Native environmental scientists, students, who, because of the sort of the critical mass of their encouragement for one another and the lived experiences that they bring, they're able to really change the dialogue. And with that collective understanding and vocabulary, they're able to disseminate it in their other classes and with other faculty members. And so it is one of those, which is almost always the truth, that the students lead the way. And so as a student yourself, I want to hand that back to you and say, lead the way, please. Yeah, oh, sorry, are you watching whose hands are first? Thank you. I will let you direct.
Not giving up my courage to speak with you because I want to express my gratitude for this book. It just let me know what profound it had on my life. It opened so many different ways. There are a lot of things I want to tell you. I don't know that I have to questions, but especially I grew up near Syracuse and learning about Onondaga Lake. I had seen the words help on the side of the hill.
Yeah.
The way you explained that, pretty just despicable what they did to that lake. And, I've made my living in landscaping and arborist.
Wonderful.
The way my thinking now has changed. Your work and Vitality and Suzanne's and art, with my arts, so many things. But I think I'd like to continue that, and I'd like to learn more about how to learn more from the native. Are there ways that you could recommend to become more things to read or more ways to get some more knowledge?
I think that the way that you are framing this of reading, of teaching yourself, of putting that responsibility on your own shoulders to learn is an important way to go. And certainly to use those resources which have been produced by Native folks. And that's really important. But in a lot of Native communities, we also are mindful of this great energy of wanting to know, right? At a time when our communities and our cultures are trying to restore traditional knowledge within the community. It was, I forget who it was, maybe Mike Wiggins at Redcliffe. And anyway, he said, well, what we have to remember is that because of all of the policies that I hope you're aware of that try to exterminate traditional knowledge, for traditional knowledge to be resurgent in our communities is like a warming fire, but it's a little fire, and it needs to grow within the community until it's big enough that everybody can be around that fire and be warmed. So it is absolutely this idea. We could apply the honorable harvest, to your excellent question of the harvest of knowledge, to take that which is given and cherish it and nurture it on your own and bring it forward into the world. So thank you for doing that. Yeah.
I have a question about hope and what these days how you're feeling hopeful. I found it so valuable in your book when you talked about the many generations that we have to have patience for change happening, and also about letting the land love us and not just love the land with reciprocity. But I find that with forest fires out west and all this news about how devastating the environment is, it's hard to keep hope going in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what's sustaining you now, and if you have any other thoughts about staying hopeful at this time.
Sure. I'm not sure that hope is necessarily the driving force. And I mean that because of the urgency of this moment. We can't sit by and hope things get better, right? Everything that you're talking about, you know, do we tend to brush it off? Like, oh no, there's another, you know, the peat bogs are on fire. The Amazon is losing its own hydraulic. I don't have to tell you, it's crushing. And what I want to say is be crushed, feel it, right? Grieve for what we are doing. You have to do that. It's healthy to do that. And when you grieve, it becomes the measure of the love that you have for the world, but you don't stay in despair. You say, what is that? When I connect that grief and that love, then what does that do? It makes you roll up your sleeves and get to work. We have no choice. It's not about hope. It is about survival. And we can't fall back on hope. We simply have to get to work. And I think about in Potawatomi, there's this phrase, ambe mash tada. Let's get going. And it takes every single one of us to do that. You know, if our leaders won't lead, then we will. And we have to do that. We have to claim that power and do it, whether it's in our yard, in our schools, in our individual life ways, individual change and system change, because there's no alternative. There's no alternative to change. Well, there is. It's called extinction.
Powerful. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
So please, we have books for sale. Again, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin's first book, and several other related titles, and the book signing will be in the back. Thank you, and if you are interested, tonight's keynote presentation at SUNY Brockport, there are seats in person available and also a YouTube stream. And it will be a keynote address quite different from this morning. So please join us again. Thank you for being here.